I will try and give you a sense of what we're doing, both in the college, or my teams in the college and in the Batten School. We are motivated by questions that social scientists have been asking for decades. We use different language. We talk about diffusion of social processes. We talk about spatial contagion, and ask questions about why do certain phenomena transmit across time and across space. So I first started getting into this, I don't know, some 20 years ago when I wrote some papers focusing on financial markets and asked questions about why does an election in a particular country move markets in another country? What are the mechanisms that cause the US market to rise when there is a cabinet dissolution in Britain, for example? And so trying to identify the different kinds of mechanisms and the different kinds of markets that connect these two countries. And that orientation has continued. The basic kinds of questions that I'm interested in and continue to be interested in is how do we identify the mechanisms? What are these specific kinds of, if we're thinking about markets, if we're talking about policies, if we're talking about people, who's a decision maker or who is a voice that is going to be powerful enough to lead people to decide that, it's time to join a movement or a caravan to move to the southern border of the United States. Who makes markets? If we're thinking about, investment or divestment kinds of decisions. And then at the more macro level, how do we think about the role of trade and migration linkages in the spread of disease? And once we can identify those kinds of linkages, what are the policy responses that can help mitigate the transmission of these kinds of phenomena? And then what are the costs of those mitigation efforts, right? So trying to think hard about what the costs and benefits of different kinds of policies are. From an analytical perspective, one of the things that really brings me to interactions here is trying to think about what are the best kinds of models, right? So as somebody who's interested in policy, we're always interested in trying to figure out what the counterfactual is and try and estimate a confidence interval around a counterfactual response. In order to do that, we need to come up with the best analytic models that will help us leverage these sorts of things. And again, I've been lucky enough to work with Madhav and Brian and Srini in trying to think about what are the best models available to help us look at, in this case, migration and the diffusion of migrants across the board. So again, just a few examples, based upon my work and the work of my team. I have focused, the last 10 years on migration. And so thinking about the way in which migrants and migrant networks help spread firms across countries. We've got some work that looks at the spread of interstate banking. Why do banks establish branches in different countries and at different times? And our argument is that it's based upon both information that migrants have, but also migrants as customers. If we think about remittances, that helps us understand the location of different banks and different banking processes. We've looked at the spread of movements across the southern border, and then thinking about the ways in which policy announcements in the United States to protect or build a wall might actually be generative in driving increased demand for entry into the United States. And then this, I don't know if you can see on the right-hand side, this is a very recent work that we did during COVID, looking at refugee camps. I should mention I run a center in the Batten School, the Global Policy Center, where our focus is really on humanitarian response. My work there is on forecasting. And so we have done a number of experiments looking at refugee camps, which are really interesting because we can identify the architecture and the spatial location of wash facilities and food facilities. And we use that as an environment to look at the spread of different kinds of disease. Both during COVID, and then we're extending this backwards to look at other sorts of disease. And it's been a really wonderful collaboration because we've been in conversation with folks in architecture, right, who can help us understand the ways in which people move within the built environment. In terms of moving forward and the stuff that we're doing now, having finished a number of projects on migration, I'm really building out a team with a postdoc that's coming in, looking at what we've learned during COVID. So we did a project, a contract-based project for Interos AI, which is a supply chain risk analysis firm, where we were trying to help them build a risk model looking at if there's a shock in a supply chain, 3 nodes away from a major manufacturer, how resilient is the supply chain? Or is a disruption in South Korea, for example, in a battery factory, to what extent is that disruption going to diffuse out? And then how do firms create a more robust supply chain environment? And so we've taken the insights from those projects and we're extending it to look at kind of large scale policy changes. So we've got a project looking at the WTO and China's accession to the WTO as a necessary and perhaps sufficient condition for the SARS outbreak in 2000, whenever that was, 2003, 2004. We're broadening this to look at different mechanisms of globalization, whether it's air travel, migration, trade, and the spread of disease, kind of thinking about the mechanism of global trade. We know that global trade was the mechanism that helped spread the bubonic plague, because of fleas that were on rats that were infesting vessels. And so we can kind of take that idea and think about, looking at trades and containerization and how that helps spread disease. And then again, if it does, what are the kinds of mechanisms that can be used to try and deter or decrease one's vulnerability? Again, some work with Interos AI, where we're looking at medical supply chains more specifically. And as part of this work, we've gotten, actually, we're beginning what I hope will be, hope is the operational word, a fruitful relationship with metabiota.com, which is they're basically a pandemic risk firm, right? And their head of research is a political scientist who I know from way back. And so we started talking and he said, we need some people to do some research. And I said, we need some data. So it thus far has been a pretty happy marriage. What we don't have and what we need, which is on my last slide, we need robust models, right? So again, I'm relatively familiar with empirical models, but I don't do simulation, and I don't keep up on epidemiology. And so what I'm very much looking forward to in these collaborations is to working with people who are discipline experts, right? And to try and get at the right contextual model that we can then use to generate and to drive the sorts of counterfactual experiments that policymakers are most interested in. Thank you.